and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. I'm Noel, and today I'm joined once again by Rich Harris. He's currently a software engineer at Vercel. You probably know him as the creator of Svelte. We're here to talk about a talk he recently gave at the Performance Now conference titled Fine Grain Everything. How's it going, Rich?
It's going great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to jump in. I was struggling a little bit with how to frame this one because in the talk, you set up like a little React demo. You talk about some of the shortcomings with React server components and why it's tricky to know what's going on there. And I think you bring up a couple distinct problems. One in this like the developer experience in using React server components, and then like the kind of performance overhead of the RSC payloads and all this stuff you've got to worry about. I want to start there a little bit. Do you think that's accurate? Do you think those are the things that people are really like thinking about now when they're talking about front-end performance, like that overhead of the exchange between the server and client and what that's going to cost in a given framework? Is that what most people are thinking about when they're talking about this stuff?
Some people certainly are. Honestly, I think most people aren't really thinking in these terms at all when they're choosing a framework. They're just choosing the thing that is going to enable them to be productive. And I think it's more on us as the creators of these tools to be thinking deeply about the impact of that. Are we designing primitives that are going to naturally result in robust and performant websites? Or are we going to create primitives that inadvertently create extra work for our servers and result in more data being transferred over our fragile mobile networks? And that's really where that talk began.
I think that there's going to be complexity overhead from the history where it was just a single page app. We're going to make API calls. The data is going to come down. We're going to kind of update everything as necessary. And like, you know, it at least feels to me like the dialogue is kind of one around like, how does one mitigate that complexity the most effectively? But I'm curious on your thoughts. Do you think we'll eventually get to a point where it feels so innate and the muscle memory is so there that it's not really a thing we have to think about, where we'd hit on in this maturity of like the single page apps of old? Or do you think there will always be a little bit of mental complexity?
It's certainly my hope that as we go about this process of better understanding what problems we're facing and thinking deeply about what sort of tools are best designed to address those problems, that eventually you kind of just land on the things that feel natural.
Yeah.
And like when you have the right tools in your tool belt, the complexity starts to kind of melt away. Like a lot of complexity that you see in code bases is really an artifact of people fighting with their tools. Like there's a little bit of a mismatch between what they're trying to do and what the tool wants them to do. And so, yeah, I think as a community, we've learned a tremendous amount over the last decade. And I know it's fashionable to decry some of the innovation that's happened over the last decade because the innovation is itself seen as a form of complexity. But really, when you look at what we're able to build with the tools that we have today versus what we were able to build 10 years ago, it truly is night and day. So I'm just naturally inclined towards optimism on these topics. And I think that we're making some huge advances. And on that note, like we jumped straight into talking about React server components and what we're doing that is not React server components.
Right.
But I have to take a moment to acknowledge React server components is actually just a brilliant idea. This idea that or backing up slightly further from the React server component implementation specifically, what we're talking about here is web developers being able to author these self-contained components which fit together like Lego blocks that are capable of expressing their own dependencies, not just on other modules with import statements or styles or whatever it is. They can also express the dependencies that they have on specific pieces of data. And that's something that prior to RSCs didn't really exist in a sensible way. Like the best that you could do is, I'm a component and I'm going to go and fetch some data from an API inside an effect or something like that, which is a horrible user experience, like loading spinners all over the place. And the React team, I think more so than anyone else, said, you know what, we think we have a way to solve this. And that is the jumping off point from which our research began. And I do think that we have a better solution to these problems than the React team do, obviously. You know, that's where it comes from. Like we're all making progress towards this end goal, which I think as a web developer is pretty exciting.
RSC, a ton of work has been done on it. It feels very clever. I think it does what it's trying to do pretty effectively, with this caveat of like, there is a little bit of just like mental overhead, I think, that one needs to have along the way. Being someone that's used the muscle a bit and I've trained it a bit at this point, to me, like I think that the telltale sign there is when debugging things, when I have to go in and look at something, it adds a layer there that I always have to be conscious of, that I didn't feel was as much a piece of the puzzle, I guess, in like SPAs of old. The mental model was a little bit clearer. But again, I think it does do what it's trying to do pretty well. So I think we can get into that a little bit deeper as we get into this kind of fine-grained reactivity and how it sidesteps that a little bit. Before we jump in there, I want to talk a little bit more about RSCs, in that in the talk, you give this demo. It's a simple like incrementing counter, and you click the button and you show the size of the network a request that the RSC payload sends back. And I wanted to just kind of hone in on that a little bit, because I think it is something that people like know it's there, but it seems magic to even most people using it. Like they don't really know what's going on. I suspect you have a much better grasp of what's going on there than most do. I know that there's some stuff that happens there. There's references to like the subtrees that are stable, and there's like kind of all this optimization that React does to only send you what the front end's going to need to re-render. But you set it up as though that's not enough, and there's always going to be some overhead there. Can you expand on that a little bit? Where is the actual pain in something a little bit more sophisticated than maybe like a counter app? Like, why is there this kind of additional overhead that's always going to be necessary for something like an RSC payload with an architecture like React Server Components?
Yeah, what it boils down to is that the server doesn't know what the client knows. Like the client is this long-lived stateful thing, and then when you need some new data from the server, that is a one and done. And so the way that RSC works at a sort of fundamental level is similar to the way that the React virtual DOM update process works, which is conceptually, at least, you re-render everything and then you like apply the bits that have changed. You compare the virtual DOM before with the virtual DOM after. You find the bits that have changed within that, which is usually not very much.
Right. Yeah.
And then you update the real DOM. RSC takes that whole concept and applies it to the communication between client and server. And the demo that I gave in the talk, when you press the button and you want to know what the updated state of that button is, you re-render the app on the server now, because these are server components, they're not client components. And the server doesn't know what the current state of the page is. So all it can really do is say, here's everything, you figure it out. And in a small app, that payload is not going to be ginormous, but it contains a lot of things that not only haven't changed, but couldn't change because it can't know. And that's where the talk title, Fine-Grained Everything, comes from. Because if you take an approach that doesn't try and re-render everything on the server, but just gets the data that the client actually needs to do its job, because the client is capable of asking for that, then the amount of data that needs to be sent back and forth between server and client is significantly reduced.
What are the decisions that you guys have been making, or what are the technical differences? Where were you like, we need to send additional telemetry to the server, or we need to send XYZ so we can focus our computation on what actually needs to be computed and sent over the wire? What were you looking at when you approached this, and what was the methodology like there?
I think it's almost just like common sense. Like if you know that this thing has changed, then just ask for that thing. And so what we set about doing was trying to design the tools that would allow the framework to do that. And so what we've ended up creating is something called remote functions, which is a feature of SvelteKit, our application framework. And remote functions are our take this idea of remote procedure control, which has become like very popular over the last few years. So RPC is a paradigm in which, instead of you, the developer, saying, I'm going to make an HTTP request to my server and I'm going to get some data, and then I'm going to get some JSON, and then I'm going to parse that JSON, and then I'm going to figure out what that means. Instead of all that, like, as a developer, you are essentially just making function calls. And as far as TypeScript is concerned, you're just making function calls. So you get type safety and all of that. And because you're just making a call that says, I want this piece of data, or you're making a call that says, I'm updating this piece of data, please give me the updated data in response, the server doesn't need to bother itself with all of these other things that are completely orthogonal to that. You don't need to re-render your nav bar just because something in the middle of the page changed.
From a developer ergonomics standpoint, if you're the person writing this code, how does that manifest differently? What are the changes in the way that you guys were thinking devs would want to interact with this and think about it and make these trade-offs versus slapping a use server at the top of the file?
I think that when you're using it, it's just a little bit more obvious what's actually happening. There's less machinery involved in producing a response. And if you were to inspect the network traffic, like it would be a lot clearer what's going on. So I don't know. To me, it feels like you just have a lot more direct control. But I think the bigger impact on developer experience from the choices that we've made is that we don't have a distinction between server components and client components. Like that divide doesn't exist. In React, when you have React server components, they can use await, for example, but they cannot use hooks like useState or useEffect. Conversely, client components, they can use hooks, but they can't use the await keyword. And so there are all of these different rules about what you can do in which components. And when you start to combine them, if you have client components inside server components and vice versa, like there are rules to how you can do that. And it's stuff that you can't avoid having to become aware of as you're developing the application. Whereas in Svelte, because that divide doesn't exist, like you're just not thinking in those terms. And as a result, like just conceptually, I think everything flows a lot more cleanly.
Yeah. Again, to my prior point, to me, it feels more akin to the old SPA world where just like you're inside of a component, it does a thing, it like updates its own data. There's maybe some shenanigans with props and some global state and stuff in there, but like the core thing that you're doing most of the time, it feels like there's this tangible closeness there. Was that kind of something you guys like set out to, or was that set out to achieve, or did that just seem to, I think, be obvious, to use the word you used before?
It did, insofar as when we're thinking about designing things, to the extent possible, we just want to use the language. An obvious example is the way that state is managed in a Svelte component. You declare a piece of state, maybe it's the canonical example, let count equals $state parens 0. And then, like you've said, that this is a variable, it has the value 0 and it's stateful, which means that if I reference that inside my component and it changes, it will update automatically. And the way that I change it is by doing count plus equals 1 or count equals 10 or whatever it is. I'm just interacting it with it as a normal variable. I haven't added an API for changing state. We're just using the language. And we've took that mindset and try to apply it to the problem of co-locating your component's data requirements with the rest of the component. It's obvious, like you just need to be able to use the await keyword inside your component. If you can do that, then you can do const data equals await fetch data. And then that's all you need, just as if you were writing a normal program. The big innovation is what happens after you've written that await keyword.
Right. Yeah.
Because in Svelte, like we don't want you to have to spend your time as a developer thinking about what is going to happen after I've written that code.
Yeah.
We want the framework to do the obvious thing on your behalf. And when you encounter an await in a component, firstly, those awaits are parallelized, because if you have multiple awaits, that you don't want them running in sequence, which is what naturally happens inside an asynchronous component, because then you risk creating these huge waterfalls, which is going to impact the performance of your application. You don't want the updates that result from asynchronous work being kicked off to happen piecemeal. If I have two components that each do their own awaiting in response to the same user interaction or the same state change, I don't want those updates happening one after the other. I want them to happen at the same time. For example, like I click on a link, I navigate to a new page. As a result, some new data needs to be fetched. I want that to feel like a single cohesive navigation. And so that's what we've built. That's the foundation of everything that we're doing at the moment, is the ability to have coordinated, de-waterfall, deserialized asynchronous updates without you, the developer, having to think about like transitions and suspense and all of this stuff. Like you're just using the language and it feels beautiful.
Yeah. I feel like you're doing You're making a lot of heavy lifting that you guys, the framework is doing sound like very obvious and like elegant
Because
and
that's the
beautiful.
framework's job.
Yeah, no, it's good. And that's, again, like advocates for the framework. That's your job as well. But I think, to me, when I hear those kinds of things, like my impulse is always then we're back in this world of the heavy-handedness is an overly strong term, but they're just like being this kind of magic that's there that could be problematic. And I'm always worried, like, as soon as something is funky in there, it's going to be really hard for me to figure out. I don't know if this is a case that would come up, but it seems like some kind of like thrashing or loop. Like, is anything like that kind of possible? When I hear this kind of parallelization thing, I'm always worried, like, maybe this is going to change, like X state's going to end up changing Y state, that's going to then end up changing X's state again. Are you guys doing anything to address those problems, or are those not really, those kind of like data integrity problems, are those not really something that would typically come up?
And we have a very extensive test suite designed to deal with exactly those sorts of scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
I hear you on there's magic happening here. But magic is what frameworks do.
That's like, true. Yeah.
There's magic here, but there's magic in getting an updated React Server component payload and applying that to your application. There's wherever you look in frameworks, there is magic. And when I press the gas pedal on my car, I don't own a car, but imagine that I own a car. When I press the gas pedal, it goes. And
magic.
between me pressing my foot down and the car going, a lot of things have to happen, and they have to happen. And I don't know that I would be able to quickly diagnose the problem if I pressed the pedal down and the car did not go. I'm taking it on faith that the people who built the car knew what they were doing. And it's kind of like that with these tools. Like you do have to place some faith in the builders of the tools, and we have to keep earning that faith. But to me, that's not a reason not to use something. Oh no, this is making my life too easy. That's what it's for.
Yeah. There's a reason we're not all writing assembly still, the world we're in. It sounds like you guys have been a little bit more aggressive in taking on the async work and offloading that to the framework, which I think is something where there's a lot of foot guns if a framework is not doing that. Like, it's easy for a developer to get in trouble with like multiple requests in flight or something at the same time. What led you guys to determine that was part of the purview of the framework to do this like parallelization, make this async handling all as smooth as it could be?
I think there was two directions. There was one, again, the example that React has set, and this is from the very beginning, like this idea that if you have things that belong together, put them together. People these days might struggle to remember that there was a time when people said, oh, you should have your HTML templates and your JavaScript and your CSS in separate files that, like, I don't know, just use magic strings like CSS selectors to link the things together. That's crazy. No one thinks like that anymore, because you want to have all of these things in the same place, because then if you move that component somewhere, everything that goes with it moves with it. And if you change something, then it becomes clear which other things need to change. And you get type safety and all these things that you can't have when you have bits of things scattered all over the place. So the logical extension of that, okay, so we've got our styles together, we've got our markup together, we've got our behaviors together, we've got our imports together. Let's get our data in the same place as well. And that is just the way that web development has been evolving over the last 10 years, and React Server Components has been pushing further in that direction. And the other direction that we came in was the limitations of the existing approach. Prior to this idea of having your data dependencies inside your components, the way that data was dealt with in front-end frameworks was you would fetch your data outside the rendering process, because rendering is this sort of synchronous thing. And then you would push your data into the components as props. And typically the way this manifested is your router is responsible for the data fetching. So if you navigate to a new page, then in Next you would have get server-side props or get static props. And in Remix you have this loader function. And in SvelteKit, we had a load function, which you can make it run entirely on the server, or you can have one that runs sometimes on the server, sometimes on the client, depending on where the navigation or rendering is happening. But the upshot is that is responsible for anything asynchronous. And the framework that sits around Svelte or React is responsible for doing that work and then taking the result and passing it to the component framework. That actually works reasonably well, but it has some massive downsides. And after having worked on SvelteKit for a few years and having built lots of apps and having seen lots of other people's apps, we kept seeing people run into the same headaches over and over again. You don't get good type safety when you're doing things that way, because the difference between accepting a prop and doing const data equals await get data, like in one case you have to specify what kind of thing you're expecting. In the other, like you just get it through inference, and the inference is going to be more accurate. The co-location problem is huge. If I have some data that I'm fetching, like at the time that I navigate through my routing logic, and then that data is used by a component all the way in the corner of the page somewhere, like it needs to get passed through all of the layers of components until it finds like where it belongs. And then if I end up not needing that component, like my requirements change and I delete that component, I have to remember to delete the fetch inside my load function. And we see this particularly with apps that are CMS driven. Like if you have a page and some component is going to need some data, but maybe it's visible, maybe it's not, because I don't know what feature flags you have and this and that. You basically have to duplicate the structure of your component tree inside the logic that is fetching the data for that component tree. And it just becomes completely unmanageable. And so these twin pressures, these React is showing everyone there's a better way, and us like having this hands-on experience of the problems that are caused by having your data management outside the rendering process forced us to think deeply about what a Svelte-ish solution to this problem would look like.
Yeah. I liked your point there and in the talk about what does type safety really mean in the front end world, and how does this kind of co-location story, like playing into that, making it simpler. There's going to always be some network stuff in the middle there, like between what a component can end up handling and like what's all the possibilities that a server could send in response to a request. What is ideal type safety for you in this client server framework world?
As an application author, I want to not have to think about types to the extent possible. Like I want everything to just be inferred, and I want the framework to provide me types in all the places that it matters. The one place that like you really do have to think about this stuff is when you are sending data from the client to the server, because when you use a remote function or any RPC implementation, what you're essentially doing is exposing a public endpoint to the world. And it's an endpoint whose address is an implementation detail. In the case of a SvelteKit app, it's like /_app/remote/ and then some sort of incomprehensible hash. And you're posting data or you're getting data from these endpoints. And if I'm like a North Korean hacker or something, then I'm probably going to see what mischief I can get up to by just sending stuff to that endpoint. And so we need to be very sure that what you think you're getting inside the function that runs on the server is what you're actually getting. And so we have a validation first approach to type safety. When you declare a remote function, the first argument that you pass is a standard schema validator. And then the second argument is the function that receives that data. And what that allows us to do is say, before we run any of your code, we can say, you're expecting a string here, but it's actually a number. And one of two things is possible. Number one, the application developer messed up. You're calling this function with the wrong arguments. Or number two, we're getting bad data. And in the first case, like that's easy because your type checker will show you exactly where you're sending bad data and you can fix it. But in the second case, like that could be because you deployed a new version and like the signature of your remote function changed. Or it could be because someone is trying to mine Bitcoin on your servers. And so the validation first approach, it prevents that at the same time as it gives you really nice type safety inside your handlers.
Yeah. I guess this is a bit of a stretch of a segue here, but I feel like we glazed over this at the beginning. You talk a significant amount in the talk too about server-side computation and cost there. Speaking of Bitcoin, someone mining Bitcoin on your servers. Like, what are the benefits? I guess maybe to roll back again. I want to keep comparing this to RSC. What's the drawback with the typical React server component flow in regards to like the work that the server needs to do? Why is that so much more expensive than a traditional flow?
To the extent that you have to re-render a whole bunch of stuff that hasn't changed, you are doing unnecessary work. And that work is not just like concatenating strings together to send it back to the client. It's also calling out to a database or an external API to get some data that hasn't changed. And like, you can mitigate it, you can work around it, you can make it such that doesn't happen if you're a sufficiently sophisticated developer. But the default is to just do that work.
Recompute everything.
To make that database call again. Obviously, if you're doing that on servers that you're paying for, your bills are going to be higher. So an approach that allows you to just like surgically get the piece of data that you need is just naturally going to be more efficient.
Yeah. Are there any caveats there? I've always felt that this default of refetch all the things in RSC world is there because it is expensive, but I think it prevents a lot of kind of foot guns, right? There's a lot of, I forgot that like I've implemented some instruction that tells it not to refetch the database when blah happens, but I've forgotten that when I actually make an update on this component, I do need this thing to rerun because I've just changed something there, but I've forgotten whatever, I've instrumented it. Do those kinds of problems manifest at all at this level of granularity, or do you think that is just completely smoothed over in a world where there's more explicit functions like this?
They definitely can happen. The example that I actually give in the talk, like I do a demonstration of what it looks like to get some data from the server and then to update it on the server. And the way that you get data from the server is with a remote function called a query, and that it can just return some in-memory state, or it can make a database call, whatever it is. And then to update it, you create a command. And if you change the state on the server or you update something in the database, that by itself doesn't do anything. You have to say, by the way, this query is going to be affected by the command that you just ran, and you need to specify that in your code. And if you don't do that, like, it's very obvious that you haven't done it because nothing works. To me, the risk of not having things update when you expect them to is much lower because you find out about it immediately. And it's generally pretty obvious what you have to do to fix that. That said, it's early days. We haven't, like, people have been experimenting with these new tools. I don't think there are a lot of production apps using it at the moment because it is still marked as an experimental feature. Not that generally stops people in the Svelte community from taking things to production.
No, benefit, I think that does a lot of lifting for you guys. Yeah, sorry.
So maybe we'll find that we need to be more mindful about the nudges that we give people or the tooling that we create to help identify these cases. But my hunch is that on the whole, it's not going to be a problem. And if anything, people have actually been asking us for us to go the other way, because so commands will only update the queries that you specify. Otherwise, like, it's just assumed that everything on the page stays the same. With a form, it's different because the form remote function is basically emulating what would happen with a native form submission.
Yeah.
So normally in the browser, you submit a form, it reloads the page, which means that you are going back to the server and you're getting new everything. And it's weird if you get one behavior when JavaScript is enabled and another behavior when JavaScript is not enabled. Form today works that same way. If you submit something via a form, everything on the page gets refetched. And some people have said, actually, I don't want that, because not every form submission should change things that on the page. For example, I don't know, maybe I have a subscribe to my newsletter form or something.
Yeah.
And if I hit that, like, I don't want to refetch all of the data for everything else on the page. And yes, if it's a log out button, then you do want to refetch everything because you don't want to keep showing data that is only available to authenticated users. But in the case of the newsletter submission button, you don't. So there's some nuance there. And we will probably need to refine the APIs a little bit to reflect that. But so far, we haven't found it to be a problem that things don't update when you expect them to. It's more the reverse, that people don't want unnecessary data to be fetched when nothing has changed.
Yeah. I guess it's not surprising to me that people wanted forms to not behave as forms do and be in the same opt-in mode, because at least my suspicion is so many people are using forms where they have there's a prevent default on there anyway, and in their head a form isn't really or the way they're using it, a form isn't really like a form doing the traditional form thing. It's like a container to work new mode of the web where they're just some little piece of the page is making a request anyway. So if that's the world you're working in, that's probably not the behavior you want.
Yeah.
So I guess that does, I'm also unsurprised that you found that most users most Svelte users want this opt-in behavior, at least these early adopters or those into Svelte right now. But I'm curious, and again, I'm wondering if you share this. Do you think there's any bias in that cohort of people? Are these kind of early users of Svelte that care about performance? Like these are the kind of people that they moved away from React or whatever framework they were using before because they like the Svelte granularity. And do you think that there's any like those kinds of biases are like helpfully pushing kind of the framework in these directions, or do you think there's, as it grows, there may be more people that are like, oh, I don't like having to opt into this as much? And if so, are you worried about serving those people, or is that like, no, that's the Svelte community, that's what we're doing?
Yeah, the performance freaks definitely are our core constituency.
Yeah,
And that is good. It makes it easy for us to keep on top of performance concerns. Like it's quite easy to let things like performance slide in a framework. Typically, when you push up a change to GitHub and your CI runs, it's checking that you haven't broken any behavior, but it's a lot harder to check that performance hasn't changed. Benchmarking is it's a much harder problem.
It tends to creep up on you.
Pass or fail tests. And it does tend to creep up on you. But we have people who, the instant we ship a performance regression, will be like, this just broke.
Yeah.
My app is now slower by 20% when I do this. Here is a very detailed reproduction. Please fix it. And in fact, right before I came on this podcast, I was working on exactly one of those problems. And it's fun. It's the kind of development where you really need to think deeply about the algorithms inside the framework, like all of the moving parts and how they fit together. I think we've figured it out, a solution to this specific issue, but there's always a new one. And yeah, so I'm very grateful that we have that kind of user base, because it's easy to make things more convenient over time and more accessible to a broader audience. It's much harder to like really fix the fundamentals if you started off on the wrong path.
Do you guys worry on the ergonomics of a thing, having to opt in to like data updates when you make a mutation of some kind, where it's like, now I've got to tell it what I want to do? New devs coming in, people, like as you say, it's obvious, right? If you're a dev and you're like, it's obvious I forgot to update this, whatever, like this table here, when I click the add row button, it's not adding a row to my table that I'm looking at on the front end. And I agree. I think for someone who spent a bunch of time here, it probably would be. But for someone new, I think there's a beauty in, we'll always just refetch all of the data. It's like I don't have to think about what parts of my model are there or what parts of my model are out of sync. And I think if you know what you're looking for, it's easy. But if you're a new dev and it's scary, do you guys think about that at all? Like, how do we make this easy for people that aren't in this world? Like,
we lean on the compiler for things like that. A classic example would be in a React component, you do const whatever equals whatever. And that const, despite being a const, will update the next time the component renders because it's doing the whole thing again. In Svelte, you have a script tag at the top of your component. And if you have a const, then that will run when the component is first created, and thereafter it will not run. And so some people are confused by that. My prop changed. Why does this const, which references the prop, not change?
Not change, yeah.
The compiler is able to see those cases. Like it can see that you're referencing a prop here and it's not inside, in effect, like it's not inside a function that can be called after the component is first created. Like you're just using it when the component is first initialized, and that's not going to update. And so it will put a yellow squiggly under the reference to the thing that is likely to change and say, hey, you probably need to wrap this in a derived because the derived will update when the prop changes. And generally, I think that kind of nudging is enough to get people into the right headspace where they understand what's happening a little bit more. And hopefully, like after you've seen that a couple of times, then like you get it, like it clicks. And from that point, it's no longer a problem.
Yeah, no, you'll have to forgive me standing up the more junior developer is more of a straw man here. But yeah, I'm always just curious on these. I think that there is, back to the very first point, I think that there is a little bit of additional complexity here. So I feel like there's just wrangling this the best way we can and making it intuitive is a pursuit that I wouldn't want to be undertaking. So I have a lot of respect for you guys taking this on. I guess, what are you guys in that vein of getting this stuff just really clean and easy to use and performant? What's the next big kind of problem in web apps that you guys are looking to solve, or you feel is unsolved and needs to be addressed?
Ooh, there's so many directions I could go in. I think the most painful part of building a web app is all the decisions that you have to make around how to do authentication and how do I store data and files and how do I do internationalization. And Like, which UI library do I use? All of those things are things that we've left to the ecosystem to solve. And they are solved. Like you definitely have solutions to all of these problems, but we don't necessarily tell you what they are. Like you have to discover that for yourself. And so we made a bit of headway on that problem last year when we launched the new packages page on svelte.dev. You go to svelte.dev/packages, like it has a list of vetted packages that we know are high quality and that are actively maintained and so on. But ultimately, what would be really lovely is if you could start a new application and like all of this stuff was done for you and you can opt out, you can use your own solutions for things. But what if you didn't have to make those decisions? So our CLI is really good at helping you set things up if you know what you want. And the packages page is helpful for you to find out what you want. But it's still not at the point where a Rails dev or a Laravel dev would be like, okay, I see what you're doing. Because in those ecosystems, all of this stuff is rightly considered part of the framework. It's all built in. And I think this whole topic of defaults and discoverability is made more relevant by the increase in the extent to which people are using agents to build their software.
Yeah, I was about to ask. Do you think that's going to help solve this problem? It's whatever, as long as the agent does something, or do you feel like there's this danger of, the agent's just going to do its thing, and if you don't know, you're just going to roll with whatever it gives you?
Yeah, you are rolling the dice a little bit when you use an agent. And maybe that's fine. Like a lot of people actually don't care about technology choices. They only care about the end result. But I think a lot of people still do care. I certainly care a great deal, especially if it's code base that I'm going to have to maintain once the agent is done messing around with it. And these things love examples and patterns that they can follow. And so if the more we can do to provide them with a happy path that they can adopt, the more success people are going to have building Svelte apps with agents. And we're certainly not about to pivot to being an agent-first framework or anything like that. Svelte is very much on the side of humanity in the coming Butlerian jihad. But right now, people are using these things a lot, and we want to be there for them. Yeah, we want the largest number of people to be able to build applications on the web, and ideally with Svelte. And solving these problems is definitely a part of that conversation.
Yeah. I think you're right. And it's an interesting point too, because my intuition is that like people that care about the defaults you're using and stuff, maybe they're prompting, maybe they're not, but either way, I feel they're going to be explicit about it. And it's more of just like a inconvenience if the thing doesn't do what you want out of the box. It's like, damn it, no, I've got to go swap something out. But I think you're right. People that don't know, like making sure the people that don't know get on the right path or have at least good enough stuff that they can kind of learn in, and they haven't painted themselves into some corner. It's probably an increasingly challenging problem with not you. Like before, you'd probably be pretty safe in assuming most people would reach for the CLI, but now it's maybe they do. Maybe they just go in and prompt it and see what their agent spits out.
Right now, everyone's workflow is so different because we're in this very chaotic period of people are using everything from like Copilot, autocomplete still all the way up to Gastown. And there's no sort of standard layer that we can build on right now, which definitely makes things interesting.
Yeah. I guess I'm just to give us a little bit more of a concrete point to end on here. Do you think that these new patterns, this kind of fine-grained data tuning, do you think that's going to end up being the path forward and the default way that most apps in general, maybe just specifically Svelte app, are built in the future?
I can't see how it could not end up that way. It's so obviously better if you can have your data alongside your component, or if you can have your component express the data dependency rather. And now that we're all developing these ways to do that in a coordinated and parallel fashion, like there's really no reason not to. There are still going to be some holdouts. Like there always are. People think that our existing approaches are perfectly fine, but like they're not. And over time, we're going to see that this will definitely be the new normal. And I'm really encouraged to see the sort of conversations that are happening in the space around this at the moment. Solid, for example, they are going to be bringing out Solid 2.0 fairly soon. And one of the problems that they've spent a lot of time thinking about is async. And after they saw the work that we had done on this, I guess you could call it an async-first approach, where you don't need to specify, this set of updates need to happen together. It just happens automatically. That is the default. They're pursuing a similar idea. And so It really feels we are in an exploratory phase, but we're making like very tangible progress. And the end state of that is going to be primitives that are much easier to use, whether you're a human or you're an agent. You need to understand less and you can be more productive. And the problems that we had before of this code references something happening over here, and meanwhile this data is being fetched in the background, and somehow that has to result in a coherent user experience. It's all going away. It's all getting solved. So I'm pretty optimistic.
Nice. Is there anything you'd implore devs to do right now? Is there anything you guys like need particular help with testing or people to check out? What would you ask of people listening?
Patience, first of all, because this we've been working on this for a full year and it still isn't stable yet. But we are going to be shipping stable versions of all of these things like very soon. But in the meantime, like everyone who tries these things out, who enables the experimental flags in their Svelte config and tries it out and then gives us feedback about where the paper cuts are, it's so valuable. It truly is. And the people who are taking the time to experiment with these things today, those are the people who have the opportunity to steer the ship. So if you're invested in what the future of web development looks like, then whether it's Svelte or a different framework, be involved. Try things out as they're being experimented on, and like you can have really an outsized impact on how the rest of us work in the future.
Nice. Perfect. Those are great words to end on, if any. But thank you for coming on and chatting with me, Rich. It was a pleasure as always.
Yeah, thank you very much.